Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's February 9th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we look at two indigenous conservation initiatives here in the United States. The importance of indigenous stewardship of their lands and traditional ecological knowledge is increasingly recognized as vital to the future of conservation and the preservation of life on this planet. Manga Bay frequently reports on Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, and we wanted to take a closer look at two that have been featured in our recent reporting. We speak with Dune Lankard, founder and president of the Native Conservancy, who tells us about kelp farming in Alaska's Prince William Sound and the larger vision of a regenerative kelp economy based on conservation, restoration, and mitigation that can provide economic benefits and connections to tradition for local indigenous communities. We also speak with Tiana Williams-Claussen, director of the Yurok tribe's wildlife department. She tells us about the more than a decade-long effort to bring condors back to her tribe's territory in Northern California, which is set to culminate in the first 4 condors being released into the wild this spring.
The Yurok people are world renewal people, are fix the earth people, and we consider it to be our foundational reason for being to take care of the land that we evolved with, which is Yurok ancestral territory. We are a part of the system, not external to the system, not masters over the system, but a part of the system. So when any part of the system is damaged or broken, we as a people are damaged and broken. Being the lead agent in bringing condors home is really getting back to that traditional role of being caretakers of the land, of bringing balance back.
Dune Lankard founded the Native Conservancy in 2003 to help Native peoples in Alaska preserve their cultures and protect and restore endangered habitats on their traditional lands. But as Lankard tells it, the story of the founding of the Native Conservancy really dates all the way back to March 24, 1989, when an oil tanker called the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Alaska's Prince William Sound and subsequently spilled 11 million gallons of oil.
I'm an Eyak, E-Y-A-K, Eyak Athabascan Indian from the Cop River Delta in Prince William Sound here in Alaska. And I'm also from the Eagle clan, and my Eyak name is Jamutsiki, which means little bird that screams really loud and won't shut up. I got that name after the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened in my backyard. What had happened was after the oil spill, Exxon came into our different communities in Prince William Sound and said, "You're lucky this oil spill happened with Exxon. We're Exxon. We do it right. And we're going to make your life whole again." And they certainly left a big hole in all of our lives. And they said they were, if your nets don't fill up, we'll, compensate you. If your rooms in your hotels don't fill up, we'll compensate you. We'll do everything right. We'll make your life whole again. Well, Exxon appealed that $5 billion verdict 17 times until they got the Supremes of their dreams. And they took the case not to make sure that justice was served, but just us was served. And so they reduced our punitive damage settlement from a 17-1 award to a 2-1 award, which they wanted to set a precedent for future man-made catastrophes that industry was responsible for. They didn't want to compensate the people.
And so was that when you first became politically active?
When I turned 10, my mother, Rosie, told me that I was the one. And I said, "The one what?" She said, "You're the one who's going to save our people and our culture and our traditions and our wild salmon and our language." But I said, "I'm 10. What about Debbie, Linda, Dawn, Pam, Bruce, and Joe?" And she said, "No, they don't have the willpower and aren't as stubborn as you are. And so Grandma and I are going to groom you, and we're going to teach you about the seasons of animals, the seasons of salmon, and the seasons of politics." And so from 10 on, I told her, I said, "So you cursed me?" And she said, "No, we've gifted you." And I said, "You've cursed me." And so they brought me into all of these different meetings because right at that time, 2 big things were happening in the early 70s. One of them was the Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act that happened on December 18th of 1971, So from 69, when I was 10 on, we were fighting for our land claims, and we were the final village to receive a land claims 2.5 years after ANCSA passed into law by July of 1974. And then in 74 is when they started limited entry and commodified our fish way of life and turned it into a permit system. So prior to limited entry in 1974, 90% of the fisher people were Native people. After limited entry in 1974, 90% of the fisher people were non-Native people. And so, two major things happened right away in our life. And so I saw what Mama was talking about and why I needed to brush up on all the politics and everything that was happening to Indigenous peoples. And so it wasn't until 1989, the year of the Exxon Valdez, that people were ready to hear what Indigenous peoples really thought about the land and the ocean. And, when you look back in the history in Alaska's body of law, 3 specific times that stand out in my lifetime was certainly the year I was born in 1959 was the year of statehood, that we went from a territory to the 49th state. The 1964 Good Friday earthquake happened on March 24th, 1964, when I was 5, and that rocked our world and our fisheries and turned everything upside down. And 25 years to the date, on Good Friday, March 24th, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened. And so I take that back. On March 27th, 1964 is when the earthquake was, but it was the Good Friday. And then here we are 25 years later from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Now climate change is again, turning our way of life and our fisheries upside down again.
So how did all of this lead to you founding the Native Conservancy, and what's its mission?
Shortly after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, we were able to get $1 billion out-of-court settlement from Exxon to set up a restoration fund to help restore the impacted 1,500 miles of habitat that was covered with crude oil in the Gulf of Alaska coastline. And what had happened was the Native corporations at the time decided to clear-cut 1 million acres of old-growth forests in the parallel path of the Exxon Valdez. And so I sat down with my family and friends and said, this is not how it ends. This is how it begins. And I said, and we're going to end up like California, Oregon, and Washington, where there's no more fisheries and no more forests if we allow this to happen. And so I sat down with my sister Pamela and I said, I'm going to have to start some nonprofits to take on the powers that be. And one of the first ones was the EAC Preservation Council, which was a cultural and legal defense fund to actually file lawsuits and block roads and take on the powers that be. And then the Native Conservancy, I formed that in 2003 because I realized that with the Exxon Valdez settlement, that the environmentalists in government wanted 3 things in every conservation easement. They wanted 1/3 conservation easement, 1/3 development restriction, and 1/3 fee simple title of our native lands. And I felt that that was too high of a price to pay for conservation in the Exxon spill zone, where we actually had to give up title in order to conserve it. But a lot of people felt that they would make better stewards than the Indigenous peoples, who have thousands of years of history, being the original guardians and stewards of our ancestral lands. And so I struggled with that. And so by 2003, I started the Native Conservancy because I wanted to figure out how to help Indigenous peoples get their land back, keep their land, and actually get conservation and cultural easements in place. So the Native peoples wouldn't have to sell their lands in order to conserve them or protect them from Native corporations. Because, see, in Alaska, rather than having reservations like in America, where they have land reserved for Indian people held in trust by the American government, in Alaska, they decided to, in our land claim settlement, to force us into native corporations. So we own 100 shares. As if we live in the village, we own 100 shares of the surface rights, and the regional corporation would give us 100 shares of the subsurface rights. So we became shareholders, and our land was held in trust by these native corporations. And so these corporate Indians were now the new governors of the land. So rather than having our traditional grandmother circles being ancestors and the guardians of the land, they were supplanted by these corporate Indians and lawyers who basically wanted to develop the rest of the land. And so the way it was set up is if you didn't develop your land and pay your shareholders dividends, then you would be forced to give your land back to the American government. And so it was an act of deception. And it was a wonderful way to separate the native people from our land in Alaska. So what I wanted to do was start the Native Conservancy and create new settlement trusts and new ways to do conservation easements that incorporated cultural easements that guaranteed the right of access to Native peoples for subsistence purposes. And after protecting over 1 million acres of land, I realized that protecting the land wasn't enough, that we actually had to go one step further and figure out how to cultivate that land and start growing things on the land and in the water if we were going to build solid food security programs during these COVID and climate changing times.
Well, that is a perfect segue to the kelp farming pilot programs the Native Conservancy is running, which I wanted to talk with you about. Can you tell us about the impetus for those programs and what the goals are?
Well, the first thing, that I realized was when I decided to start a food security program was that our growing time on the land is in short supply because of the shortened seasons, of having good weather and warm weather and a growing season in Alaska. And so June, July, and August is about what you got. And then, before that it's cold, and after that it's cold and raining or snowing or whatever. So I'm an Ashoka fellow, like my friend Bren Smith from Green Wave. And so I contacted Bren and I said, I know that you have a solution for growing, kelp and mariculture products in the ocean. And I'd like to, have a sit down with you. And so we got together and I went back to New Haven, Connecticut to see him and his farm. And I realized that on one of his website pages it said, "Who farms matters." Well, to me, as an Indigenous person and a lifelong fisherman since the time I was 5, all I've ever known is the ocean, and my education came from the Copper River Delta and Prince William Sound. And so to me, that struck me because who farms does matter, because this mariculture movement, whether it's kelp or bivalves, and bivalves being mussels, clams, oysters, and scallops and several other species, that this is a modern day land claims on the ocean. And I was concerned about that because, the fishermen have the boats and have the money, as well as the seafood corporations, the processing, the canneries, the hatcheries. All of these organizations have millions of dollars, and they've controlled the seafood industry and the ocean for the last 150 plus years. And so the last thing that I wanted to see happen was where Indigenous peoples not only weren't able to get permitted on their ancestral lands, but the only jobs that they would get from these canneries and processors was to grow the kelp, harvest the kelp, and then process it for them. And then they make all the money and we make nothing. I wasn't in the mood for that. And after going through 150 years of that nonsense, we saw at the end of the day that it took jobs away from our communities. And I wanted to figure out how to relocalize our lost economies and bring the women and the youth back to our villages and create blue carbon jobs that actually helped people do 3 things. Because of the 36 tribes that are interested in working with our Native Conservancy across the oceans in Alaska, they're interested in the kelp space for 3 purposes in this order. Number 1 is restorative purposes. to help the ocean in the best way that they can. Number two, to grow a traditional food source that they've harvested for thousands of years. That was a staple of their diet historically. And then three, was to build a regenerative economy that they could actually get good paying green blue carbon jobs for taking care of the environment. And so in working with Indigenous peoples across the state, I realized that there were a dozen or so barriers to entry that we needed to start. Our Native Conservancy needed to start pilot programs that would actually help them address these concerns, ranging from, what kind of boats do you use? Can you convert older boats? And I feel that we need modern day 40-foot LCMs with lots of deck space so we can hold totes and the boat could have a dozen different jobs rather than just one. And figuring out how you're going to do your landscape analysis, how are you going to do your kelp farm site analysis? How are you going to figure out how to get a long-term low-interest deferred loan payment program in place to help Indigenous farmers where, to get a permit costs upwards of $10,000 to $15,000. Your average Native person can't afford that money to even do that. So I wanted to figure out how to create this loan program. So we've raised enough money to get 15 to 20 farms in the water this year. Then we wanted to address, how are you going to cultivate your seed? How are you going to harvest it? How are you going to cultivate it? How are you going to deploy it? How are you going to process your kelp in the fall? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to value add it and be able to process it and turn it into usable byproducts? Because there's about 150 different food byproducts or more that you could turn your kelp into. There's everything from kelp fertilizer, compost, animal feed, bioplastics. There's pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, cosmetics. I mean, the list goes on. And so I felt that if Indigenous peoples were going to enter this space, that they had to figure out what their end game was. And as a commercial fisherman, I realized that, if we could form some sort of a native kelp cooperative, so we could create co-opetition between us and cooperatively grow more kelp, it would be better for the ocean. That if we could figure out how to start a native kelp alliance, 501c4, to figure out how we could leave the kelp in the water longer to sequester more carbon, how we can do programmatic permitting, get 10 permits at one time instead of just one, how we can be able to do carbon sinks, and then also to get maximized carbon sequestration. And then at the same time, how can we do direct seeding so we don't have to always use buoys, lines, and anchors? And so a lot of these concerns made me realize that we needed a 501c4 so we can actually do legislation. So a lot of it is organizing the tribes and the people and trying to address all of the issues and concerns in the industry in order for them to make the best educated decision going forward.
So what does kelp farming actually look like? What activities are involved?
Everything from, diving for their seed. We started a diving program to get certified native divers last year. So the divers can go down and find their wild seed, because you have to harvest it within 25 miles of your kelp farm. And then we have to figure out how to, get that wild kelp seed into our seed nursery. We built the first portable one in the state a couple of years ago. We're moving it to Cordova this summer. So we can grow our own seed, because I didn't want to be held hostage by any seed growers. I wanted us to be able to learn how to cultivate and harvest and deploy our own seed ourselves. And so then in the fall, we do our own deployment, and the individual farmers would need to decide whether they wanted to do test farms or actual kelp farms. And so some of them, want to do the testing, but it takes just as long to do a test farm as it does a kelp farm. So I recommend, them getting the kelp farm so they can get the kelp in the water. Because here's the thing, when I meet with different tribes, I say to them, I go, well, imagine you're sitting in front of your window in your cabin in your bay, your ancestral land and you're looking out over the sea and you're sipping on your sovereign cup of coffee, and all of a sudden a boat comes rolling in the bay deploying anchors, lines, and buoys, and it's not you, and that permit is good for 10 years and can be renewed for another 10 and another 10. I said, how would that make you feel? And they go, oh my God, we have to figure out how we're going to get a kelp farm or a mariculture farm in the water in front of our ancestral land. And I said, absolutely, because you don't want to have to travel 30 to 40 miles in winter weather, because unlike fishing, the seafood industry, we start in May and end in October. In the kelp farming industry, we start in October and end in May. So in the darkest, coldest, wintry, snowy storms, we're going out to monitor our kelp farms. And so there's a number of things that people just have to learn, everything from learning how to run a boat to how to dive for your seed, how to cultivate it, how to deploy it, how to build arrays and kelp farms and test lines. And then you have to figure out, how you can determine the best sites. So understanding the salinity and the clarity and, the water temps and, is there too much fresh water coming into this area? Is there too much silt? And with the glaciers melting at unprecedented rates, it is a concern. And so there's all these, dozen or so barriers to entry that our Native Conservancy is addressing to help Indigenous peoples to make the right decisions.
You've talked about the food security and economic benefits of restoring these kelp forests, but you also alluded to environmental benefits. Can you tell us more about those?
When the ocean heated up in 2018, to 76 degrees for 3 weeks, 20 feet below the surface, 40 at low water. Millions of krill, mussels, wild kelp forests, salmon, and birds died. And so I realized as a fisherman, that all I've ever known is the seasons of fish, that if I was going to continue my livelihood, I had to figure out how to, get habitat back in the water for all of these species, because there's about 300 different critters that make a living in wild kelp forests. And so I felt like, if we could figure out how to get that kelp in the water, then there would be habitat for shade and also habitat for protection for the different species that can hide in the kelp before they get strong enough and big enough and fast enough to take on the predators at sea. Because a lot of the whales and the sea lions and the seals, they just open their mouths in front of these hatcheries, because the hatchery fish are some of the dumbest fish in the sea. And they'll swim in broad daylight and do the backstroke right in the mouth of all of these critters that eat them. Where a wild salmon will only travel to the ocean or down the streams during nighttime against the banks. And they're really skittish of any shadows, where hatchery fish are born and raised in hatcheries. And so when they see a shadow, they think somebody's coming to feed them. So they go towards the shadow. Well, that shadow means death in the ocean. And so what we're hoping is that with these kelp forests that, they'll be able to, hide in these kelp farm forests that we're growing, and they'll, be able to hang out a little longer and get a little stronger before they go on their world tour for 2 to 7 years, depending on their species. And then the herring, haven't recovered since the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. I think it's only warranted 2 fisheries since then. And we went from over 200,000 ton to 4,000 ton returning. And this last year, on a good note, there was as many as 20,000 ton that spawned on the eastern Copper River Delta rather than in Prince William Sound. And so what we're hoping is that the kelp farms that we're growing, that these herring will spawn in the cooler, colder, cleaner waters of our kelp farms rather than on the intertidal zone where there's still oil seepage and lingering oil that is leading to their mortality rates being really high. So we're hoping that they'll understand and realize that, because I believe that they're smarter than us. And then the other thing is that kelp can sequester carbon 5 to 20 times more than living terrestrial forests. bivalves can filter 40 to 60 gallons of water each per day. So one oyster farm can clean out an entire bay in an afternoon itself. So what our hope is that with having the kelp farms in the water, and the longer we can leave it in the water, the more sequestration there will actually be. And so we'll be able to do carbon insets where we're focused on getting paid to do carbon sequestration rather than carbon offsets where we're trading carbon. We're not interested in that. And a lot of the indigenous peoples are not across the board.
So my understanding is that the Native Conservancy is the first native-led and owned land conservancy in the U.S. Can you say something about why that's important and necessary?
When I started the Native Conservancy in 2003, Native peoples didn't believe that, they should have to buy their land back, or, they didn't believe in they didn't believe in land trust because they felt that the land trust movement was just about colonialism and locking up the land and throwing away the key. And so Native peoples were like, how are we going to, get involved in this? Because it seemed like a racket. And there was this one wonderful funder who had followed my career for a while, Susanna Colorado, and she just said, Dune, I love what you're doing. I want to figure out how to help you, form your Native Conservancy land trust that you wanted to form. And she goes, how come no one has done this before? And so I told her, what I just told you. And that was that, Native peoples didn't trust colonial conservationists, and that, they wanted to protect their land and have cultural easements that guaranteed their access in traditional ways on their own land. And so when I formed it, a lot of Native people, went out of their way to tell me that I was wrong, that this shouldn't happen, and that, government and conservation groups should just give the land back to the Native people. And I said, well, good luck with that. In the meantime, I'm going to start this Native Conservancy. And then I started saving habitat and started getting more attention. And then fast forward 20 years, now I'm the chairman of the board of the Native Land Trust Coalition that represents about a dozen different land trust groups. And there's more and more Native land trusts being formed around America and around the world, because people are realizing that, they have to have some vehicle in order to receive land when someone like the government or conservationists or, these new millionaires and billionaires actually want to buy land and give it back to the indigenous peoples, because they were and still are the original guardians and stewards. And so I felt like, I had started a movement and I was part of something that I saw was wrong. And that is that the public interest valuation process was skewed, and that it should include intrinsic values like wild salmon, native culture, clean air, clean water, that, there was other intrinsic values that a lot of people think are priceless, we believe are irreplaceable. And so the only way that we felt that we could address those concerns and create a new settlement trust and change the public interest process was by creating a Native Conservancy led by and run by Native peoples.
Just looking forward a bit, what's the most exciting or hopeful thing about this work for you?
What's really exciting for me is seeing the Native youth rise. And, I joke with them, I say, my exit strategy is you rising. And in reality, that's the way it is. Because, the Native youth and even all youth, they need hope and inspiration. They need to see that, there's a different way to live on the planet and a different way to do things. And, and I really feel that, when a lot of interns and a lot of press and people, come up and share our story and what we're doing and get out on the ocean with us and see, that all we're doing is basically sharing thousands of years of experience and history and occupation of the sea with people who are basically land-based. And when they get out on the ocean, something comes alive inside of them. They're realizing that, there's all these species that are underneath them that are living in the ocean. They realize that climate change is actually happening. Ocean acidification is real. Ocean warming is real. Ocean rise is real. And that we can actually do something. And so what I'm seeing is that, there's a lot of youth around the world that are the inheritors of the planet that we leave them. And right now, rather than just leave them with bad decision debt and less choices, I want to leave them with hope and more choices and some sporting chance that they're going to not only be able to survive, but thrive on their ancestral lands in different regions around the world. Because the reality is, at the end of the day, is migration of the people on the planet has already started because we've killed so many places on the planet. And we have this opportunity to do the right thing in some places, especially in the ocean. And we need that in order to survive as a human race. And so I'm really excited to see all the youth rising and learning, which, people go, oh, well, you just started this new industry and it's kelp. Well, the first job I ever had from the ocean was harvesting herring roe on kelp when I was 12 years old. That was my first income from the sea. So here I am at 62. The last income 50 years later from the sea is back into kelp. So it all comes full circle. But what we need to do is inspire people, inspire foundations, inspire governments to fund 1,000 global solutions that actually make a difference while it still matters and gives people hope and inspiration to go on another day.
California condors will soon be taking wing in the skies of Northern California for the first time in over a century, thanks to the efforts of the Yurok tribe, which has spent the past 13 years working to bring the critically endangered species back to their tribal territory and the Pacific Northwest at large. Tiana Williams-Claussen, director of the Yurok tribe's wildlife department, says that California condors have great cultural significance for her people and an important ecological role to play in the region.
So California condor, or Preganish in the Yurok language, have lived in our ancestral territory since time immemorial, as we say. From a more Western science perspective, they were quite prevalent throughout what's now the United States, really focusing kind of on more the coastal and mountain ranges, all the way up to British Columbia, down to what's now Mexico, across the United States, and up into what's now New York. Their range had shrunk considerably by the time of Western colonization, I guess you might say, such that by the 1850s, their range had shrunk to just kind of eastward of the Rockies in the Nevada area, though still north and south about the same. By the 1950s, their range had shrunk to a small wishbone shape in central California. And it was actually at the end of the 19th century that the last condor was seen in Yurok ancestral territory. So it's been over 100 years now. Our relationship with condors goes back to the beginning of time, before even humans were really the people of the world. We consider the animals or the spirits of the world to have been the first peoples and to have taught us a lot of the ways of being that we continue on with today. And so our relationship with Condor specifically ties to our role as world renewal people, or fix the earth people, as we say. We consider it to be our foundational reason for being, to keep the world healthy and balanced. And that means physically, so the wildlife health good, the ecosystem good, water, air, all of these things that go into making a healthy system, but also the spiritual component as well. But so one of the ways that we do this is through our world renewal ceremonies, which are considered the highest of our ceremonies. Include the jump dance and the white deerskin dance. And so our relationship with Condor goes back to the beginning of time, when the animals of the world, the spirits of the world, were kind of designing how we would move forward in this way. And I've heard the story told a couple of different ways. On the one hand, I'm told that Creator went to all of the animals of the world and said, I need a prayer, I need a song for these ceremonies. They're going to be one of the most important things that we do. And on the one hand, I've heard the story told that all of the animals immediately started singing their best and their brightest and their most beautiful because they wanted to impress and have their song chosen. I've also heard it told that there was crickets and nobody said anything because they were daunted by the magnitude of what they were faced with. In either story, Condor does not speak up because Condor is not known as a songbird. He actually doesn't have a voice box, and so he communicates through hisses and grunts and things like that. But Creator looked into his heart and saw the pureness of his spirit, his kind-heartedness, and said, no, I want to hear your song. And so, sure enough, Condor sang, and it was about what you would expect. It was a bunch of hisses and grunts and not impressed with himself. But Creator heard the true worth of the song, the spirit of the song, and he said, oh, that was the most beautiful song I've ever heard in my life. Let me sing it back to you. And sure enough, it was the most beautiful, most powerful, most wonderful song that had ever been heard because the Creator sang the pure spirit of it. And we continue to sing that song today in our World Renewal ceremonies. In our belief, condors also contribute directly to the ceremony through the use of their feathers. We believe that when an animal gives of himself to our regalia, that their spirit is carried along with it. So that spirit of renewal, that spirit of kind-heartedness is carried into our World Renewal ceremonies. My family definitely taught that condors are not to be harmed because of this great spiritual worth. So any feathers that we receive are considered to be gifts from the animals that we find on the ground or in their nests. And we also believe that he carries our prayers to the heavens and across the world when we are trying to bring the world back into balance. He's actually the bird that flies highest of any in our ecoregion. So we haven't had condors here for well over 100 years now, and that has been deeply impactful to us as a tribal people. Of course, we remain World Renewal people. We continue to dance these ceremonies, but this major component has been missing for so long now. In particular, I feel that we were at risk of losing our relationship with him. I, for one, know that as a young woman, I wasn't necessarily taught the importance of Condor, not because he wasn't important, but because he wasn't there to engage with. He wasn't there to talk about and hadn't been for so many years. And that's something that we're working to fix.
So when was the decision made to actively pursue reintroducing the condor to your tribe's territory?
We've always had an interest as Yurok people in bringing Condor home because he's such an important part of our system. But we started actively moving towards it in 2003 when a panel of our tribal elders specifically designated to prioritize natural and cultural resource restoration chose California condor as the single most important land-based species to bring back to Yurok ancestral territory, largely because of his cultural importance. So that decision was made in 2003, and the tribal government worked within the system to try to garner interest from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to start the process of bringing them home, which was a several years process. But by 2008, we had received our first funding through a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tribal wildlife grant to start a feasibility analysis of, is it even possible to bring condors home? So that was actually the start of our condor restoration program, and it was actually the start of our wildlife department overall. A condor was our flagship species, so to speak. I was hired on as the first employee at that point. I had been a technician at that point, and we very shortly after hired our senior wildlife biologist, Chris West, to start the program. It was just the two of us right off the bat, and for a couple of years. Our program has grown exponentially since then. We help monitor and manage a whole range of threatened and endangered species now. We deal with invasive species. We work with wildlife habitat restoration and harvest monitoring and management. And we've grown from a 2-person crew to something like a 16-person crew. And I've matriculated to the directorship at this point. Chris maintains his role as the Condor program manager and specifically focuses on condor restoration. But the big news is, after a 6-year National Environmental Protection Act process, we culminated our environmental assessment with a finding of no significant impact. And so, of course, that's the federal process that kind of gives us final permission to bring condors home. That decision was made in March of last year, 2021, and we are looking at releasing birds within the next 2 or 3 months. In 2022, probably April of 2022.
Well, that's incredible and must be so exciting for you. But when the decision was first made to bring the condor back, how was it initially received? Was this considered feasible from the get-go, or was it considered more of an impossible dream?
I think that depends on who you ask. So as to the question of whether this seemed like an impossible dream or not, the Yurok tribe is really good at attaining impossible dreams, I have to say. We underwent quite a bit of damage after colonization, after American conquest of our homeland. And that includes damage to our physical homeland, damage to us as a people. We nearly lost our language because it was illegal to speak for so long, and our children were sent to the boarding schools and forced to speak English. And of course, so much of who you are is carried in language. So who we are as a people suffered quite a bit. But we've done some amazing things in the meanwhile. Like, we have this incredible language restoration program. One of the big ecological dysfunctions was installation of 4 major dams along our Klamath River, which is our main homeland, and we're taking those guys out probably next year. So we dream big, and we tend to have the capacity to meet our dreams. That said, when we first proposed bringing condors back home, the understanding that I get from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was a kind of, who are these guys, and why do they think that they should get condors? Thankfully, we actually had a really good tie through our Condor program manager now Chris West, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at that time. He had both been an employee of the service with their release facility down in Southern California, so he was familiar with all the crew down there and with the leads. But he was also a master's student up at our local university, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt University. And that's kind of how we met Chris. He was doing a master's thesis on condor behavior. He hooked into the tribe, and we started talking, and knowing condors, he knew that our region was one that was ripe for bringing condors home. And so he kind of acted as a liaison between us and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to say, hey, I think these guys might have a good idea here.
So what did your research into the feasibility of returning condors to the area look like? What kinds of threats or conditions did you have to consider?
While we wanted to bring condors home, of course, the big question remained, was it a good idea to bring condors home because of how much our world had changed over the last 100 years? They had left for a reason. And so a lot of those reasons, unfortunately, seem to be human-related. There was a lot of destruction of the habitat that they relied on, the old-growth redwoods that they nested and roosted in, the expansive prairies that actually local tribal peoples maintained in much larger expanse than they are right now. We actually only have about 1% of our traditional territory prairies, which we maintain through prescribed fire pre-contact. That led to a reduction in the foods that condors relied on, who relied on those prairies, but also the influx of a lot of new humans reduced our animal populations quite a bit, particularly deer and elk and bear, the seals and the sea lions that condors feed on. There was also introduction of new poisons. For example, landowners would put out carcasses poisoned with strychnine to kill other sorts of scavengers and predators like wolves and coyotes and bears and the like, but which condors would incidentally eat and die from. There was direct harvest of condors because people thought they were pretty cool or because of scientific collection reasons. And there's kind of 3 things that still remain a problem, as these other issues have somewhat been rectified. But the 3 issues that remain a problem are contamination from the use of lead ammunition, remnant DDT in our system, and then power line collisions and electrocutions. So those are 3 things that we really wanted to assess before we brought condors home. I'll start with the easy ones first. The easy ones, I guess I would say, are the potential for DDT contamination and for power line collisions. And the power line collisions, we started doing an overall habitat analysis, looking at how condors use the landscape in places that they were currently free flying, and extrapolating that to our landscape to kind of identify how they might use our landscape. And so we correlated that with where all of our power lines were running, working with our local utility companies, PGE and Pacific Power, and saw that it doesn't look like that was going to be a problem for our condors. The problem really arises when these lines cross major flight corridors. The birds are flying so fast, they can't always see them, and so they can collide with them. But all of our power lines kind of follow the roads, follow the rivers, and don't really cross them in major ways. The next thing was DDT. And so DDT, of course, if anybody's not familiar with it, was a chemical that they used for insecticide. It was used both to control mosquito populations and also to help protect crops from pests that might eat them. We since found there's all kinds of issues with using DDT. When it comes to birds, it causes eggshell thinning in a whole host of different birds. And if you have eggshell thinning, you more typically than not have a failed egg and reproduction failure. And so that's actually a problem in the current flock in Central California, which is co-managed by the Ventana Wildlife Society and Pinnacles National Park. They're in an interesting place in that they know that they have DDT contamination, but about 50% of their birds are reproducing successfully without intervention. So not all of their birds are being affected, and they're kind of on the cusp of being on a very clear positive upward trend for reproduction. So the way that we assessed DDT in our region was to look particularly at blubbery marine mammals, because DDT is lipophilic, it's fat binding, and so it bioaccumulates in these long-lived blubbery animals like California sea lions and harbor seals and migratory whales. While our area is relatively pristine in terms of those sorts of chemicals, our concern was that these migrating animals would go to more contaminated areas, like the Montrose chemical spill, where they actually dumped just barrels of DDT in the Southern California Bight, bioaccumulate, come back to our shores, and kind of die and be these DDT bombs. But the really good news there was that there's a very clear decreasing trend in DDT from south to north. So Southern California is very contaminated, Northern California not so much, and Oregon and Washington even less. And we found by doing a comparative analysis of our DDT levels to DDT in other areas that we were about 7 times lower in our California sea lions than the Central California area, where the flocks were being impacted but might be on the cusp of being okay. So that doesn't mean we won't have a DDT problem. It doesn't mean we won't have reproductive failure, but it's very hopeful to me that it won't be a problem, that our relatively pristine area up here will be less contaminated and a good place for successful reproduction. And I left the most complicated one to the last, and that is the potential for lead contamination in condors. So lead, as we know, is a toxic element. We're already getting it out of pretty much everything else we can think of. We got it out of our paint and our gasoline and our pipes, largely due to its impact as a neurotoxin, though we know now that it actually impacts most of the systems in the body. And condors, as well as other scavengers in our area like bald and golden eagles, are just as affected by lead, particularly as a neurotoxin. For condors, it's a particularly unpleasant death, unfortunately. It will freeze their digestive system so that, on the one hand, they can't eat. The food just sits in their belly and it just kind of rots there, so they can die of disease that arises, or they can die of starvation, or they can die of weakness or inability to fly appropriately because of the neurotoxin, which leads to predation. And so, for example, in 2020, as much as 50% of condors with known mortality actually died from lead contamination. It's complex because it's somewhat controversial in the sense that the use of lead ammunition has been implicated as the primary source for lead contamination in condors in the wild. And the way that it gets into the system is lead is the most conventionally used material for ammunition, in part because it's a soft metal, so that when it impacts an animal, it will actually fragment into hundreds of pieces. And each of those hundreds of pieces carries kinetic energy throughout the animal and gives you a clean knockdown power for killing an animal, which is what any hunter wants to see. The problem is each of these hundreds of pieces of lead, while probably not going to impact an adult human like ourselves, it would just pass through our system more often than not, works differently with a condor. Say some of this lead gets into a gut pile, which gets left behind by most hunters, would normally actually be a very good source of food and is representative of why hunters are so necessary to our ecosystem these days. If it's studded with lead, a piece as small as the head of a pin is enough to kill a condor without treatment. So lead is the most conventionally used material for ammunition. Hunting is something that's very important to our society, particularly even our tribal society here, which relies on food, on harvested food for, the food that they feed their families. So how do we address that? The first step, of course, was to assess whether it was going to be a problem or not. And so the way that we did that, not having condors to study in our region, was to look at avian surrogate scavengers. And so that was looking at turkey vultures and common ravens who eat a similar diet to condors. So the turkey vultures are most like condors, obviously. And in focusing on them, we found that about 1 in 4 of our turkey vultures had elevated blood levels at a level that would be considered a problem for a condor. It's not apples to oranges because they process lead differently than condors do, but it was an indication that it was in our system. That study was a little bit stymied because we could only look outside of hunting season because birds were migrating while inside of hunting season, which means you couldn't be sure where a contaminant load came from. So we also looked at common ravens, and common ravens are non-migratory, and we could look at them inside and outside of hunting season. And we saw a clear correlation that inside of hunting season, their blood lead levels were going up in the common ravens. So we do think that the use of lead ammunition in our area is going to be a problem. That said, very early on in our project, knowing that it probably would be a problem, knowing that it was a problem in other areas, we started our Hunters as Stewards project. And our Hunters as Stewards project is designed to reach out to the conservation ethic that many hunters in our region hold dear to their heart, which makes sense because they're the people who really like to be out in the wilderness. They like to have a robust and a healthy system because they appreciate it. And so we started our Hunters as Stewards project, and the primary goal was to reach out to hunters, let them know what the issue is, let them know that there's alternatives out there. There's actually primarily copper ammunition, though there's other amalgams out there. And say, hey, what are your concerns? Answer those concerns and say, hey, can you partner with us by transitioning to non-lead ammunition? And we had what I consider to be wonderful success. Anywhere from 85 to 95% of the hunters that we spoke with said, I had no idea this was an issue. I care about condors, I care about eagles, and I care about what I can do to make a difference. And they said, absolutely, I will make a switch to non-lead ammunition. And we still have people coming up to us saying, thank you so much for introducing us to this and helping us make that transition. And we did that through ammunition exchanges. Give us a box of lead, we'll give you a box of non-lead. We did shooting events where people could try it out in their own rifles. We went to sportsman groups and gave presentations and tabled and things like that. It is definitely a sort of one-to-one conversation. You kind of have to convince each hunter, it seems like. But we did have a lot of success there. Since then, California has actually banned the use of lead ammunition for all hunting. And there's pros and cons to that. Pretty much anybody in the wildlife world who deals with raptors can tell you that yes, lead is unequivocally a problem and we have to get it out of the system. But particularly in California, where we tend to be pretty heavy-handed when it comes to gun legislation, there was immediate pushback when that legislation came through, especially because people who cared about condors were saying, hey, save the condors by changing to non-lead ammunition, but not having that really in-depth one-on-one conversation with the hunters who are going to be impacted. And so a lot of doors that had been opened kind of slammed shut on us for a while. Now, that said, we've continued to push and doors are opening back up again. People are getting used to the idea, and our method and our messaging is still telling the whys and wherefores to help people, bring people on board, but also just helping them make the transition based on this new legislation that's now a fact. Ultimately, we'll see how it plays out. There is actually an entirely voluntary program in the Arizona flock that's coordinated between the Peregrine Fund and the Arizona Department of Game and Fish, which has about the level of success that we saw as well. 85 to 95% of hunters engaged with made the voluntary switch to non-lead ammunition. So it'll just be a matter of time to see which approach is kind of the better approach, but in either case, we're working to get lead out of the system. It's definitely going to take time.
What are your plans for monitoring the birds once they're released, and what in particular will you be looking for or monitoring them for?
Those were kind of our three major questions that we wanted addressed. Lead remained the biggest issue, and which we continue to combat that today. But knowing that lead was going to be an issue, we also went directly to the existing release facilities. And while Chris had already had a lot of experience working with condors directly, I was pretty new to the business myself. But we actually trained with these existing facilities to learn how to monitor and capture birds as needed, to see that they're doing well and healthy, or if they needed intervention. So one of the things that the existing release facilities do is twice annually at least catching as many of their birds as they can. And the reason for that is to do overall health checks. Are they looking healthy and well? Are their transmitters doing okay? But then ultimately to also do blood lead assessments to see if they've undergone lead contamination and if it's making them sick. And so we had the opportunity to go down to these release facilities and learn how to do all of these things, and also to some of the treatment facilities to learn how to treat birds that have been contaminated with lead. And that's primarily through Chelation Therapy. So if a bird got elevated blood lead levels, but they seem to be doing okay in the way that they're acting and behaving, we can do chelation therapy in the field. It actually gloms onto the lead and pulls it out of their system. If they're really looking unwell, then we need to transfer them to an actual treatment facility. So we've also been developing a partnership with our local Sequoia Park Zoo, which is the only AZA certified zoo in our area.
The AZA is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
And they are building a condor care facility specifically for us, the Condor Care Center, so that we can bring birds to them directly if they're too sick or they're too injured for us to handle. And they can either treat or they can triage before sending them on to one of the more intensive care treatment centers. So there's other treatment centers at the Oregon Zoo, the Oakland Zoo, the LA Zoo, the San Diego Zoo, mostly going along with the breeding facilities that captive condors are bred in as well. And so we've got this whole decision tree to see what do we do with a bird if they're sick or injured or being contaminated with lead, because it's such a big issue. I don't think I mentioned before, but the California condor population actually got down to just 22 individuals in the entire world by the mid-1980s. Through both a captive breeding program and now successful wild breeding, having been re-released into the wild in the mid-1990s, there's over 500 birds total, and over 300 are actually living in the wild. And so making sure that every single bird, even though their population has grown so much from what it was, is of paramount importance. And so every single bird is managed and tracked as much as they can be. Every single bird is treated if they know that there's an injury or illness that they can't overcome. And so that's going to be a big part of the work that we're doing once condors are released. We will have crews monitoring them literally every day. There's no days off. There's no holidays. There's no spring breaks or anything like that. They'll be monitored through satellite transmitters. Every one of our birds will have satellite transmitters that will ping at least once an hour to tell us where the bird is at. Those satellite transmitters will have a mortality signal. So if the bird doesn't move for a long time, we know we need to go out and check that bird out. It could be that that bird is sick or injured. It could be that it's dead, unfortunately, in which case we want to recover the carcass and find out why. Could be it just dropped its transmitter, in which case we know we need to recapture and reapply it. They'll also be equipped with a visual tag so that anybody can look at a condor and know which individual it is, and also with a radio transmitter tag, which allows us to track them down in the field, because while the satellite pings once an hour and gives us a general sense of where they are, if we need to get eyes on the bird, the radio transmitter will let us track them down to a much closer proximity. We will continue, as with the other release sites, trapping at least twice a year to make sure that our condors are healthy and well.
So you mentioned that you plan to release the first 4 birds this spring, perhaps in April. Can you tell us about the birds you plan to release?
The birds that we will be receiving are going to be juveniles. They'll actually be coming from the captive breeding facilities. We have our first cohort that's been picked out for us. There's 4 birds. There's 1 female and 3 males. They're currently staged at the Ventana Wildlife Society while we continue to finish up our release and management facility up here. But they will come up here probably sometime this month in February, maybe in early March. And then we're aiming to release them in April of this year. After this first cohort is released, we're aiming to release 6 birds every year for the next 20 years. And while these birds are juveniles, we'll be adding to our flock within the next 5 or so years when they start breeding in the wild. They typically start breeding about 6 to 8 years old. And so hopefully our population will just grow and grow and grow until such time as it's viable.
And you'll be releasing those birds in Redwood National Park, right?
Yes, we'll be releasing 4 birds into Redwood National Park in an area that we did a lot of research into to identify as a good release area. So that means that it's got a lot of the traits that a condor needs. It's got a lot of open prairie around it. It's got a lot of trees for potentially roosting and nesting. It's got access to flight corridors. It's also relatively remote from human populations, but also has road access for us so we can get out and monitor the birds at the site. And like I said, so this release area is going to be in Redwood National Park. Redwood National and State Parks has been an amazing partner for us, even before there was a wildlife department, so to speak, because we got started in 2008 and our government had reached out to the Redwood National and State Parks in 2007 to say, hey, we'd really love to bring condors home. Do you want to partner with us on that? And they, at that point, said, yes, absolutely. So they've been our partner hand in hand since the very beginning. And the site we located is both in Redwood National Park, but also within Yurok ancestral territory, helping meet conservation and restoration priorities for both of our entities.
What ecological benefits will there be in returning condors to the area?
So, the ecological benefits of scavengers in general are legion. Some people may be familiar with the problems that vultures are having, say in India and the like, where their populations plummeted because of a particular medicine that was being used in livestock there. And they were finding all kinds of ecological and health issues that went along with that. For example, the scavengers weren't there to be doing their cleanup job, so there were other scavengers moving in, like packs of wild dogs, which was a danger issue, but also increased threat from rabies. There was other diseases that were coming about because of this, and obviously nobody wants carcasses just rotting on your landscape. And there's estimates that scavengers put in literally billions of dollars worth of conservation services to the ecosystem. So not having scavengers is a very big deal in your system. Now, we're not that bad off because we do have our turkey vulture, we do have our ravens, we've got more terrestrial-based scavengers like bears and the like who will eat a lot of these foods. But a big missing component has been with our marine mammal population because we don't have a scavenger that's large enough to break into and start breaking down these thick-skinned, blubbery animals. The bears don't usually come down, the turkey vultures are too small. And so condors actually really love those marine resources. And so once they return home, they're going to be able to open up those resources. So not only are these animals no longer sitting on our shores and bloating and being gross, but it also opens up the food for other scavengers once the tough skin has been broken. So it's going to result in more food availability to the broader scavenger guild as well. So we're getting by. That's the really nice thing about ecological redundancy, in that we have our turkey vultures in addition to the condors we historically had, but we're going to be getting by much better once condors return to the landscape.
So Manga Bay covered your efforts to bring California condors back to your tribal territory back in September of last year. And we'll link to that article in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But you were quoted in the piece as saying that this is an example of how tribes are taking back authority and power over their land. Can you elaborate on that?
So the Yurok people, our world renewal people, are Fix the Earth people, and we consider it to be our foundational reason for being to take care of the land that we evolved with, which is Yurok ancestral territory. We are a part of the system, not external to the system, not masters over the system, but a part of the system. So when any part of the system is damaged or broken, we as a people are damaged and broken. Unfortunately, when American contact hit, it hit us pretty hard. One of the ways that we were impacted was being forced off of our lands and onto the Yurok reservation, which, don't get me wrong, we were blessed to have a reservation because many tribes didn't even have that. But it's actually only 10% of ancestral territory over which we had jurisdictional authority. And the reservation is something like a state boundary, in that you have jurisdictional authority over it, but you don't necessarily actually own the land in it. And so a lot of our lands were sold off or taken away from us and actually given to other parties. So while we had the jurisdictional authority, we didn't necessarily have the real get stuff done authority. Despite being put onto the reservation, so to speak, our moral obligation to the whole of our ancestral territory remains strong and true. And so we're working to rectify that in one way through actually buying back our lands. We've bought back, I think, well over something about 60,000 acres of our traditional lands, which we can now manage in a way that is healthy and well. But we work quite a bit with entities outside of our tribal government in order to co-manage our ancestral territory to meet the restoration and balance priorities that we have. So as a tribal people, we have this responsibility to care for our lands, but we had that capacity taken away from us. Being the lead agent in bringing condors home is really getting back to that traditional role of being caretakers of the land, of bringing balance back. It's really epitomizing that responsibility that we've had since time immemorial, and which was taken away from us. So as a tribal government, as a tribal people, this is in a very real way expressing our inherent sovereignty and our inherent role as caretakers of the land in a way that we haven't been able to do in over a century now. Restoring of the California condor epitomizes in a lot of ways the restoration of the Yurok people and our role in the world, and the restoration of the Yurok world. So I'm not even going to begin to say that we're the only such amazing restoration project we've got going on. There's a lot of incredible work in so many different ways that the Yurok tribe is working on. But I think we're something of a shining light to say, hey, this is what the Yurok tribe is about. This is who we are as a people. We restore, we bring balance, we are Fix the Earth people.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Manga Bay Newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to all of our new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.